So I'd like to take a minute now to tell you a little bit more about today's webinar, Designing with the Base of the Pyramid. It's presented, as I mentioned again, by Saul Garlick, who is the CEO of an organization called ThinkImpact. So I'd like to also give out a recognition to the coordinators of the E4C webinar series. Obviously, I'm giving a shout out to myself, along with Holly Schneider-Brown, Alex Torres of IEEE. I'd like to thank you all very much for helping put together the series. And of course, I'd like to encourage you to contact them via the email address visible here, webinars at engineeringforchange.org, should you have any troubles or have any questions following this webinar. Before we hand things over to our presenter, I thought it would be a great idea to remind you about Engineering for Change and who we are. E4C is a global community of over 10,000 technically minded individuals such as engineers, technologists, representatives from NGOs, and social scientists who work together to solve critical humanitarian challenges, whether in water, energy, health, agriculture, sanitation, or other areas faced around the world today. We invite you to join E4C by becoming a member. E4C membership provides cost-free access to a growing inventory of field-tested solutions and related information from all the members of our coalition, including professional societies such as Engineers Without Borders USA, the Institute of Electronics and Electrical Engineers, academic supporters such as MIT's D-Lab, and international development agencies like Practical Action, as well as access to a passionate, engaged community working to make people's lives better all over the world. Registration is easy and it's free. You can check out our website, engineeringforchange.org, to learn more and to sign up. So a little bit of information about the E4C webinar series. The webinar you're participating in today is one installment in the E4C webinar series. This free, publicly available series of online seminars showcases the best practices and thinking of leaders in the field who bring leading-edge technology and solutions to bear on global humanitarian and development challenges. Information on upcoming installments in this series, as well as archived videos of past presentations, can be found on the E4C webinars page. And you can see the URL there is engineeringforchange-webinars.org. Our next webinar will be in collaboration with Engineering World Health, and it'll be titled Building Technical Capacity and Resource for Hospitals. It'll take place on Thursday, August the 30th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. To register for this webinar and give us a couple of days to pull up the information, but registration will be open soon, please go to engineeringforchange-webinars.org. So a few housekeeping items before we get started. First and foremost, I see some of you already started doing this, but we'd like to invite you to share with us where you are from today. In the chat window, please type your location. And please note that any technical questions or administrative problems should also go in the chat window. Feel free to send a private chat to our host and moderator, Holly. You can also use the chat window to type any remarks you may have. During the webinar, please use the Q&A, the question and answer window, located below the chat window, to type in your questions for the presenter. That way we can group them all together and the presenter can address them at the end. If you're listening to the audio broadcast and you encounter any troubles, try hitting the stop and then the start button. If that does not work, you can use the call-in number for the teleconference. You may also want to try opening WebEx in a different browser. Following the webinar, to request a certificate of completion showing 1 professional development hour, PDH, for this session, please provide your full name and date you completed this webinar, as well as the code that we will give you at the end of the session. Send this to eab-ceuadmin@ieee.org. So with those housekeeping items in mind, I'd like to now introduce to you today's presenter. Today's presenter is Saul Garlick, and Saul is a social entrepreneur with a long history in public service. Saul is the founder and CEO of ThinkImpact. It's a company that turns the old development and aid model upside down. Saul serves on the board of directors and treasurer for Young Professionals in Foreign Policy, on the board of stakeholders for the University of Pacific's Globes Center for Social Entrepreneurship, and the board of directors for Eye on Poverty. In 2001, Saul was recognized as a top 9 young foreign policy leader under 33 by the Diplomatic Courier and is a member of the Young Entrepreneur Council. He is a U.S. speaker for the Bureau of International Information Programs at the Department of State. He blogs regularly for the Huffington Post and Social Edge, and his work has been featured in Inc., Entrepreneur, and the Washington Post, A Truman Scholar. Saul graduated from Johns Hopkins University and Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And we are very, very pleased and honored to have Saul here, and I'm going to hand over the presentation to him now to introduce us to designing with the base of the pyramid.
Hi, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Saul. It's a pleasure to join you for an Engineering for Change webinar. Thanks, Iana, for putting this together, as well as Holly, Victoria, and your team. I'm really excited to be talking to you about a subject I've become extremely passionate about. And just for background, I am not an engineer. I'm not a technically trained individual. I am an entrepreneur who works with a lot of really creative, really smart people who are looking to solve the greatest challenges in our global community. And I think it's important for everyone on this call to see and feel how they can play a central role in making change. Everybody has an important role to play, and I'm going to get into the details there. But that's sort of the premise that we work with here at ThinkImpact. So hopefully you can see a really cute dog on your screen right now. At ThinkImpact, we really talk about one phrase all the time. We want to make every moment high impact. Every moment that we're working in rural communities in Africa, every moment that we're here in our office in Washington, D.C., every conversation like this, every time we interact with someone, we're interested in making it high impact. And so one way to describe it is that we're always waiting with our tongues out for exciting ideas and innovations. And that's really what the company exists to be about. Now, for a little bit of background, ThinkImpact is a social enterprise based in Washington, D.C., which offers 4 primary programs. The first is called the Institute, and that is an 8-week full immersion program based on a curriculum for students and young professionals from the United States and around the world to live and work in rural communities in Africa. We're in 4 countries in Africa, Ghana, Kenya, Rwanda, and South Africa, where we have community relationships and we host our programs all for the sake of designing with the base of the pyramid, which I'll get into in much more depth. The second program we offer is called the Summit, and this is basically a short course, a 10-day immersion experience for individuals from around the world to learn about the economic landscape in emerging economies. One of the most important things that you'll hear me talk about today is the power of market-based solutions to poverty. And one thing that we all need to do more of is engage in what that really means. And so our Summit program is an opportunity for professionals and business students and graduate students in other fields to get direct engagement with what that question is really all about. Another program that we offer is called the Huddle, and that is an annual event that brings together university faculty and administrators to basically turn their teaching models in their campus, on their campus, upside down, to really get them thinking creatively about how they're creating experiences that lead to highly valuable skills and useful knowledge sets to make their campus and their broader community higher impact, but also to create more effective employees and entrepreneurs down the line. And finally, we offer a program not too different from the Huddle, which is called Extreme, and that is a highly intense sort of social innovation simulation, which is offered primarily to young professionals and professionals. So ThinkImpact has a history of offering a variety of programs to engage people in this question of how do we make every moment high impact? And what it actually came down to was this simple notion that when we design, when we work on solving problems in these communities, wherever we are, the most important thing is to do it genuinely and authentically with the beneficiary, with the consumer, with the individuals in the communities where we're working. Oops. All right. So for a little bit of background about how I came into this work, for context, back in 2003, I went to South Africa on a visit with some student friends of mine after I had fundraised to build a school in a rural community. And I was there basically to see the value of the work I had done in fundraising here in the United States. And I had essentially built 3 classrooms. And when we went in 2003, it was really breathtaking. You know, you arrive and there's a whole ceremony, there's a celebration. We're seeing these beautifully constructed classrooms, and there were going to be, you know, laboratories for computers and new desks and all kinds of resources for the students. And we thought, wow, we have really changed the world here in this rural community in South Africa. We have done something that is catalytic, that will change people's lives. And, you know, we were really excited in 2003 when we saw how far our dollars could go. When I returned in 2007 to the same community, I saw how wrong I was. This particular school had actually not utilized the classrooms properly. There was an entire classroom that was sort of dedicated to storage that was run down. There were bugs eating old books in boxes. It was dank. It was damp. It was just sort of a disaster. And not all of the rooms were like that, but certainly in a school where students were learning under trees before we had built classrooms, it was shocking to see an unused classroom. Really a waste and really a disappointment. And that is sort of a metaphor. That's sort of an example of the kind of challenge that we face when we talk about alleviating poverty, when we talk about change in the global community. At the end of the day, development, this word that we sort of throw around, international development, is not what we think it is. We make a lot of assumptions about what development is about, what development is for, and actually we find ourselves defending the field of development over and above the important work of actually creating change. And so the point of this conversation, and I think it's particularly powerful to be talking to this very diverse global community on this call, is to get serious about how we talk about change. And I'd like to introduce a couple sort of simple principles as to what I mean, and then we'll go into a bit more depth. So the first thing is that whenever we talk about making a difference, when we talk about international development, when we talk about solving problems, if we're wealthy in a society and we want to alleviate poverty within our country, if we are a student and we think that everybody deserves access to education, if we are a philanthropist in the United States and we think that it's just unbelievably impossible to wrap our heads around the idea that 3 billion people live on less than $2 a day, wherever we're coming from, we are often in the position of looking at people's problems and we're sort of united around a common goal. We want to solve other people's problems. It's not a bad thing. It certainly doesn't sound bad. It sounds, if anything, like a really wonderful, altruistic, sort of from the heart mission. The problem actually doesn't begin with the common goal. It begins with the common solution, which is when everybody takes that next step and says, we want to solve other people's problems, so what we're going to do is solve other people's problems. So the irony is that we take the notion of changing the world for others, people who do not necessarily even know us by face or name, and we decide that we're going to take the leap and we're going to solve their problems for them. And this is a tragic reality, and it's actually something that we have not only done on an individual basis, which we have not only done through charity, but it's something that we have done through government. And it has led to an entire structure that is, I mean, in all truth, not changing the world. It's not solving our deepest and most significant challenges of global poverty. And so what we need to do is take a step back from that pedal, from that premise, which we'll get into in just a second. But what's really interesting is after we have this common solution and then somebody says, wait a second, are you going to solve other people's problems? Are you going to go in and give them a solution that you think is in their interest, but maybe they don't think is in their interest? So there's some critical thinking and there's some questioning around the solution. We often backpedal when we're trying to solve other people's problems, and then we promise to do two things. First, we promise to create some community ownership. We promise that we will engage the people. We will give them a stake. They'll be responsible for construction. They'll be responsible for building. They'll be even maybe responsible for bringing cement bags to help us build the project. We're going to get their skin in the game. That's what we decide. And the second thing that we say is we'll always hand it off. We're going to create sustainability by training the local population to begin to use whatever solution we've created, and we will hand it off. We will train them and prep them and get them ready for that big, exciting day when they own whatever has been created. The problem is that that has some very faulty premises. That is based on the notion that the people are even interested in the solution that we have offered. And we often talk about that, and we often think as a society that we're providing value because people have asked for something. People say, we need schools, we need laboratories. And so the assumption is that, well, if we provide you a school and we hand it off, that it will last forever and it will change the world. But the thing is, that's a narrow conversation. We're not asking enough questions there. We're not asking what people bring to the table. We're not asking what they really have going for them before we assume that we should just fill those needs. And so we actually start with the wrong premise, that there's a problem to solve and that we should solve it and then hand it off. So if the premise is wrong, if our basis for approaching a development problem is wrong, then we're very likely to be on the wrong track for the entire lifespan of the project. And unfortunately, and this is of course what nobody wants to say out loud, we are therefore bound to fail. We simply cannot do things for people. We cannot provide solutions at them, to them. And unfortunately, we cannot realistically hand off solutions to people. Because anytime somebody shows up and delivers something and then says, here, it's yours, it's not really taken to mean that it's theirs. It's not really a pride point for that local population. In fact, it creates the very dynamic that I think is so tragic, which is the recipient sort of, I'm a charity case, I'm a donor-dependent receiver of your support. And that creates a dependence model that can be very dangerous. And so we need to actually move past that, but we need to do it in a way that's really productive for humanity. The only reason I would say any of this is not because I don't think we should help people get ahead in the world, and not because I don't believe in the value of social change and the power of social change that we all have. It's that we need to do it smart. So what I would say is when it comes to the premises, this how we solve other people's problems, the most important thing to keep in mind are the fundamentals of humanity. What makes every person in the world the exact same? Now, of course, we have a diverse crew on this phone call, so we can talk about people from Japan and people from Brazil and people from South Africa as each having unique culture, each having unique desires and preferences and tastes and histories and circumstances, access to different natural resources. We could go into all the myriad of differences. But when we want to create social change that lasts, that's not where we should begin. We should actually begin at what makes every person the exact same. Now, I've traveled pretty far and wide. I'm very fortunate to say that I visited many continents. And the one thing I've learned is that everybody likes the exact same few things. Everybody wants food, family, community, entertainment, relationships. Everybody cares about the very basics, and everybody has a natural incentive to look after themselves. Everybody must, of course, look after their own self-interest first. So there's an incentive structure that is common to all people that we can actually utilize as an advantage when we're trying to create social change, because it propels us forward. When we use human incentives, when we work with the basic fundamentals of humanity, we are actually inviting something that is scalable and that is high impact. Now, before I carry on, I want to invite everyone to throw questions in the Q&A section. There's a Q&A box on your screen. I'm happy to answer any questions as they arise, or maybe I'll save some for the very end. I'll do my best to answer all the questions, but my point of being on this call is, of course, to provide information to you that is useful and sort of in-depth and relevant to your local community and your local circumstances. Okay, so everybody should see the slide now that's called How We Engage. So it's good to talk about how we all have a common humanity and how we all have natural incentives and how we all are interested in designing with the base of the pyramid, and really, what does that all mean? And the answer to me is about sort of meeting customers, meeting consumers where they are. So the very essence of this sort of how to approach that common humanity question comes down to how we actually engage people. And I have this funny, simple saying that I use around the office and with our programs, that people are people everywhere. And it's amazing how many times that phrase gets repeated, because when you cut through the culture, when you cut through the circumstance, you find that people are fundamentally the exact same. So the only way to understand the broader context is to directly engage with the population, to understand their situation. And then not only is there an opportunity for us to directly engage, which means more than just asking questions and more than just, day visits, but it might very well mean living side by side with the community that we hope to impact for a good period of time. Once we want to solve problems, we need to engage the people who we hope to benefit directly in that process from minute one. We can't delay. We can't dream up big solutions in isolation and ever deliver those to the population. Every step of the way needs to be done in tandem with the local population. And that makes this whole process extremely difficult. So as a fair warning, anytime you're serious about engaging with a different population or a low-income population, you are going to be learning and experiencing culture shock and going through your own critical thinking process, your own culture shock experience. And you're going to be learning so much that the process itself is going to feel at times maybe too difficult, maybe not worth it. But it is worth it, because the only solution that's going to have any bearing on the future is the one that actually comes from that local population. So the first thing to learn, the very first thing to learn is how to ask questions and truly listen to the answers. And it's funny, when we work in our rural communities, in the rural communities in Africa where we send students, we will teach the students to ask questions, the same question, in many different ways, because there's always room for misinterpretation. So if you ask somebody in rural Kenya, is he your brother? You may very well find out that they say yes. And then you ask the question, is he your mother's sister's son? Then they may say yes. And what you found out is they might be referring to their cousin as their brother. But in America, you would only refer to your brother from your same parent as your brother. And so we need to spend time asking questions carefully, to listen carefully at what is going on in a community. And the most important thing we can do is learn to listen, which is why I put it first. Listen to what people are saying and then ask them follow-up questions. And it is incredibly critical that we do this. I find, at least here in the United States, we too often make the mistake of approaching global poverty reduction and poverty alleviation with we have a lot of material resources, we have a lot of wealth. Clearly there is something we can deliver to a population to turn that around for the poor population. Surely we need that one thing. We need girls in school. We need to provide better transportation. We need to provide clean water, and that will change everything. But of course, in actual fact, any community, any society is incredibly complex. And there is no cure-all. There's no single solution. So we need to listen very carefully to get the nuance of the culture, to get the nuance of what people desire. And that is the fundamental basis for action. But now I want to take that to the next level. I want to give you sort of 3 steps that I think will lead to success in whatever social change undertaking you are personally involved with. So the first is to begin with context. And so in our programs in rural communities, we actually do not start by training students to, understand Rwandan society from a book, and they're going to go, and then they're going to be ready to act, and it's time to work on brainstorming some really cool ideas to solve problems. That is not our approach. Our approach is you can read from articles and books, and you can get some background, and that's going to get you ready for the beginning. But ultimately, what we need to do is just spend some time in a community and gain context. And so I'll give you 5 examples of how we gain context, 5 concrete examples. First of all, we have a laundry list of shared cultural experiences that students can engage in. So this means everything from the way people collect water to the way they clean their dishes or manage waste and trash to the way that they transport goods to market. They will shadow community members. They will experience daily life with people that they're hoping to impact. And that's incredibly important. So I'm seeing that we have some call drops. I want to just make sure before I go on that we're okay here.
I can hear it well on my end here, Saul.
Okay.
If attendees, those of you who are having issues, do please notify us in the chat window, and Holly and the rest of the team will address your inquiries. But why don't we move forward, Saul?
Great. So the first example of how we might begin with context is simply to share the cultural experience. Now, I say this to people who have come from a rural community, who have gone to university in their country, to people who are visiting from the United States to China, to anybody going anywhere. The minute you have stepped out of your comfort zone, out of your home base environment, it's important to re-engage with the local context. You will learn more by being an active observer, by being an active participant in the local cultural experiences and noting the way people spend their daily lives. So shared cultural experiences is one great technique. Another technique for gaining context is to do character profiling. So we call it character profiling, which means you literally would conduct interviews with perhaps dozens of individuals to understand not how they spend their day, although that is interesting and useful information as well, but what skills they use every day, what skills they have, what they know. And that unleashes a whole slew of opportunities. Because if people start to appreciate what they're working with and the skills and resources that they have at their disposal, then they know that they have something within their context to leverage to create change. Another thing that we do, which is probably a little different, is sitting and observing. A very simple observation of the community and how people interact in the marketplaces. One example of this might be how we maybe map the financial transactions. What kinds of financial transactions exist in a community? How do people trade? Is it in kind? Do they barter? Do they trade with mobile phones? Do they trade with cash? How do they ultimately work with money? And mapping those financial transactions is a great technique there. And finally, I'll offer the empathy map, which is an idea of trying to put yourself in other people's shoes. So it's good enough to get the experience and follow them and track them for a day, but go a step deeper to what is motivating them and how they are experiencing their daily activities. Is it a burden or a pleasure? Women who collect water in a distance might see it as a pleasure because they are spending that time with other women in that community. It might not just be a burden, even though carrying water sounds like a burden. It's really important to feel the experience, to understand how others feel in their process. So those are some examples of how we gain context in a community. Now, I mentioned learning about local skills with character profiling. I mentioned the idea of asking not what people need, not what they lack, not if they need another schoolhouse, but what they have. And what's incredibly important is once you understand the context, once you've worked in an area and you've learned about several context points, contextual notes, take that a step deeper and begin mapping all of the resources that you have at hand. So anybody who wants to design at the base of the pyramid, anybody who wants to solve problems and create change is actually looking at what they have available to them in these communities and working from that place, rather than saying we simply have no access to money and so we therefore have no way of doing anything, because that is not true. I have never been to a community where that was true. In fact, in the poorest communities, the least developed communities I've been to, they still have assets, they still have goods, they still have markets, they still are trading. And so we have to look at the assets. And that means mapping those assets. That means the physical and natural assets in a community, the resources that are available, but also the people, the institutions, the associations, the community-based organizations, the microfinance organizations, All of those comprise the assets that exist within a community. And then don't forget the power of social capital. So one asset that is often overlooked is, of course, the asset of trust. So understanding what makes people work together, what binds them, what helps them be successful is incredibly important. And this leads to the next really compelling point about design, and that's the notion of positive deviance. So this is sort of a complex concept, but basically a positive deviant is an example of success where there should not be one, an example of unlikely success. So there's a famous story of a man who went to Vietnam to work on nutrition, and he was given a budget, and he was told to end hunger and malnourishment in Vietnam, which was a very ambitious task. And he looked at his budget and he said, there's no way I'm going to be able to do that on this budget unless I get creative. So his approach was to go to a community and to find out, in a community where there are many, many malnourished children and families, where or what examples exist of children in that community who are not malnourished? Are there any healthy kids in that community? So the basis of the question was, rather than look at what people need, which is obvious, more protein, more food, healthier choices, access to food markets, access to more opportunities, rather than saying, well, we can't save the world with more access, let's find out what people are doing right. And what he found was that the poorest of the poor in this particular community in Vietnam were actually experiencing the lowest incidence of malnourishment. And why was that happening? That was happening because in that community, there was a cultural bias against eating the local seafood out of the river. But the poorest of the poor ate everything that was available within the riverbank. So when they collected food and when they were getting their rice together, they would throw in some of the local seafood from the riverbank to supplement the rice. While the slightly better off, financially better off community members were rejecting this seafood as not culturally appropriate or not acceptable, they were experiencing worse nutrition. Meanwhile, the local population was getting the protein that they needed to live a better quality of life. That was a positive deviant that ended up shaking the whole situation, and the culture shifted. They started to educate people on the value of putting those seafood elements into their rice and into their cooking, and it ended up making a huge impact. And it didn't cost much money at all. It was just an awareness campaign. It was just an engagement strategy. And so what happened is they engaged the locals, first and foremost, to lead on that action, to engage in their culture, and to connect with the community to solve problems. And that's when change is real. So the thing I'll end on here, the final question is, no matter where we are in the world, what is our role? And, this is something that happens. This is a question that arises for everybody who goes on our program. What are we trying to accomplish? What are we here for? If we want to design with people in the communities, if we want to make an impact through locals, what do we really bring? And the answer, actually, in spite of what it might seem from my whole presentation, is a lot. We bring an outsider's perspective, which is a fresh set of eyes on an idea. We can look at things without any bias because we don't actually know the historical context for every decision that's been made in the community. So we are there as outside catalysts. When we go into a community to make a difference, we can bring together players in that community who typically don't work together. We have a convening power, which means that we should most likely lead by offering just good questions, by drawing out ideas from others, and potentially offering a few ideas of our own. Though we should not recommend our ideas, we can only help add to the mix. So we can lead and we can help guide people to new approaches. We can rock the boat, but we can also facilitate conversation. And one of the most interesting things is when we have students on our program working, let's say, 2 American university students working with 3 or 4 local community members on one team where they are working together to solve a problem. Those 2 Americans end up facilitating the conversation, but the local community members are the ones who really drive the conversation. They're the ones who have the ideas. They're the ones who understand the situation. So facilitating is a very powerful and critical role here. And of course, we can ask questions that lead to helpful consultation. But I warn against prescribing solutions. I obviously am passionate about this, and I've said it a couple times, but what we never want to do is walk into a community and tell them what they need, or just respond to their first request and say, well, if you need that, we'll bring you that. Because the first request might not be at the root of their problem. It might not be at the root of the challenge. More food, broadly speaking, might not have solved the problem in Vietnam, as well as cultural awareness to the value of the food that was already in their community. So we have a facilitating role in that. And that is, I think, a very powerful role to play indeed. So I'm going to look at some of the questions that I got. I'm going to have to scroll up. Thank you for your questions. And I'm going to answer them once I get through them. So just give me...
Well, no worries, Saul. Don't worry. We've been keeping a track of the questions as well. First and foremost, I just thank you for your presentation. And at this time, I'd like to encourage our participants to throw in their questions into the Q&A window. One of the questions that came up already was kind of related to what you ended your talk with, the notion of prioritizing and understanding what is the most important need, which must be satisfied first. So maybe you can speak a little bit more about prioritization of needs as they are identified within a community. So let's say community members bring up a number of needs, even with your techniques applied. How do you prioritize those needs and understand which to tackle first?
Sure. So before prioritizing needs, we first want to identify what assets exist. So we don't take a needs-based approach. We don't start with what people need. We start with what people have. Once we've identified what people have, we will get community members together to brainstorm what we call a how might we question. And a how might we question sounds like this. It's how might we solve a given social challenge with the resources that we have. So what that means is there is no way of knowing in a given community what the most important need is, because it's totally personal. The need for water is as important as the need for food, right? Or the need for education is as important as the need for healthcare for long-term development of a community. It is not our business to prioritize the needs of others. But what we need to do is spend time with the community members and find out what they are most passionate about. Because just like here in the United States or in Sao Paulo or in Singapore, people will be motivated by the things that they are most passionate about. And so rather than try to address a most important need, we must engage the the local community member who is with us in the design process to identify what they want to solve, what they would work on first. And so you brainstorm out all kinds of needs after you've already, all kinds of social challenges after you've identified the resources that you have, and you have to pick together what that first challenge is that you will undertake to solve. But, everybody has a different solution. If we could just get kids, everybody has a different priority need. If we could just get girls into school, then everything will change. If we could just get access to capital, then everything will change. If we could just get, health care so that children aren't dying of malaria, everything will change. If we could just reduce, maternity or infant birth rates, everything would change. There are a million cure-alls, and the truth of the matter is that in every community there are people who want to work on different challenges. And we have to find people that we click with, that we have chemistry with, and we can work on whatever need or challenge they are personally most passionate about, because they're going to be the stakeholder that stays in the community that makes things happen.
Thank you, Saul. We have a couple more questions, so I'll give them to you as they've come in from different places.
Sure.
So one question that's come up is from one of our listeners who wants to know is, what if we come to a community that has a history of being, quote unquote, given to by outsiders and want to implement some of these ideas? How do we overcome the past mistakes? Or do we need to go somewhere that has not had outside influence before?
That's an excellent question. Thank you for that. It's something we confront every day in our work at ThinkImpact. I don't think that it's going to be very easy to find a community that has never been touched by outsiders. And those outsiders might even mean a government that promises big things and has in some way cultivated a dependency culture or dynamic. So what we do is we create community committees in the villages where we work, and we train them on what we're really there for. And this is tricky because we do not bring any gifts, we do not bring any grants. We only pay them for a fair market wage for what they do. So if we're hosted at their home, we pay them for the food and for the accommodation. But we do not build them a school to gain access to their village, so to speak. So they have to agree that this will be a different scenario where they are not getting free money, in essence. But I think it's critical for the future of international development to approach these communities with a sense of entrepreneurial optimism and to say we want to work and we want to listen as we go through this process. We want to treat the local population with great respect, and we want to learn. And if you put it in the if you frame it as a cultural exchange first and foremost, I think you have something to work with, because people understand the value of learning from others. We learn so much from rural Africans when we go on our programs, and rural Africans will learn from us just because we're different. And when we bring two cultures together, we're more likely to create innovative solutions. And so everybody feels that. But it's definitely not the typical. It's not the norm. And in many cases when we work in communities, as we move around, people will ask for money. They'll ask us for a scholarship. They'll ask us for if we could just help build their church. And the list goes on and on. The challenge is sticking to your guns, making no promises, and reminding them that your ultimate purpose there is to share ideas and to create together. And, sure enough, by the end of the program, we've always got innovations that have come from community members, people who feel extremely empowered because they've never engaged in a process like this. And frankly, they feel respected and valued. And that, I think, becomes the seeds of really meaningful and significant change. And it couldn't be more important. There isn't a country in the developing world where the expectation on government providing, solutions is not a problem. I am totally for government. I believe that there's a huge and important role of government, but that government role cannot sap society of its entrepreneurial spirit. And when people are waiting for a handout, when they're dependent on an outsider to show up, you have undercut that whole dynamic, and that is very dangerous for society. So I say, saddle up for the challenge, but going into a community and saying, we're here to learn from you and we're here to share ideas and to have a constructive conversation for a cultural exchange, I think that becomes the baseline. And then, of course, the asset mapping and all of the work that goes on, done totally hand in hand with the local population, ends up leading people to a new place. And one thing that we do at the end of our program is something called the Innovation Exhibition. And this is an opportunity for community members to showcase the ideas that they've worked on in front of other local business leaders and government officials. And it brings together hundreds of community members, and they are able to see and experience all of the vibrance and all of the energy that comes from creativity. And that ends up shifting people to a different mindset. I'm told to keep my questions shorter, so I will do that now.
You're very thorough. You're very thorough, and I would like to make sure that we get to all our questions. We have a few more. Just with respect to, making sure we manage our time here. One question that came in that I think is particularly intriguing also is here, can you recommend a way that I can help my students to get a feel for the context given that they can't actually visit these communities? Granted, it won't be as good of an experience as a visit, but is there something I can do? I'm taking this coming from a teacher.
Great. So I'm going to just be a little bit selfish here, but I urge you to visit blog.thinkimpact.org. And the reason I'm telling you to do that is because we have wonderful pictures and blogs, hundreds of them, from students on our program, going through the process, thinking through the challenges that they experience. So I urge you to check out blog.thinkimpact.org, and that will give you a lot of material to work with. Another thing that I encourage is to check out hcdconnect.org or .com. I think either works. HCD Connect is a website where people are using design and they're sharing ideas and they're sharing their stories. And, this is through a great design firm called IDEO, and we partner with them. And on that website, you can also find what they call the HCD Toolkit, or the Human-Centered Design Toolkit, which is the basis for some of our curriculum. So I encourage you to use those resources.
Thank you, Saul. If I can add on a little bit, also, if you're interested, reading some of the stories that we publish on E4C can give an idea of some of the context and helping actually to really kind of walk through the shoes of a community. We have a lot of photo sets from different community visits that kind of get you inside of a home, inside of these projects up close and personal. So a couple more questions, and we're going to try to get through them quickly. I apologize if we don't get to all of these questions to our attendees, but we have one more that came in that someone would like to understand or get an answer to how this could be used for designing project-based learning curricula and engineering education. So if maybe you could kind of speak to the engineers on the line and those who are interested in really infusing these kinds of approaches into engineering curricula.
Sure. So I actually, my experience working with engineers is that engineers go on programs and are very sharp and have great ideas for the technology and for ways to leverage local tools and local knowledge to create solutions. The problem is too many design solutions from engineers are unsustainable because the local population was not part of the process from the beginning. There are not enough sort of I would say, engagements with local community members on how they operate and how they function, there's just sort of the one-size-fits-all. So, I'll use the standard example. Everybody wants to solve the global water problem, 1.1 billion people living without access to clean and sanitary water. It's tragic, so people go and build wells all over the world. The problem is those wells are totally unsustainable because they have mechanical requirements that the local population, number one, maybe doesn't know how to fix, number two, doesn't have the resources to fix, and number three, they see this solution as being not their own, not the kind of solution that they care deeply about. And once it breaks, it's a done deal. I mean, I've been to schools where a spigot breaks on a water tank, and the community just decides, well, too bad. Nobody gets water from this tank. And it's a full tank, but the broken spigot renders them useless for years at a time. I think that that's a flaw in the process. I think the process for an engineer should be much more immersive, it should be much more listener, and it should be a little bit less technical. I think we have to get it down to the very simple essence of problem solving. And anytime you're sort of jumping ahead on the technology, you're leaving the local population behind, and we have to be very careful of that. And so engineers need to be encouraged to leverage all of their brilliance and all of their ideas only to make things simpler. And that is really the only way that you're going to create, I'm talking about very rural, poor areas, but you really need people in the population to feel like to really be part of the process and to propose their own solutions.
Right. So that's a very good point. We have a couple more questions, actually. So when you say that we cannot give people the total solution, are you saying that we should rather work with them throughout the making of the solution so they can take the solution as theirs and therefore use it properly?
Definitely. We often say that we're pre-idea. So when you're looking at assets, you're looking at skills and these things, you're actually you don't know what problem you're there to solve yet. You're almost a solution searching for a problem in a way, right? Because every society has problems and everybody wants to make a difference in the world. But what we need to do is approach that intelligently. So the first thing we must do is understand the people and identify people in the community that we would want to work with. Just like in a school group or just like in a association, we like to work with certain people. When we have that chemistry, that becomes the foundation for the next step. And then the community member, the individual that we want to work with, becomes part of the process. And then we come up with an idea, a solution to a social challenge, and that becomes the basis for action. And then it's actually not a question of if the community member feels ownership, it's the community membership. The community member is the owner. There's just no two ways about it. If you do this process right, there's no chance that the community member doesn't feel direct ownership because they were part of the entire thing. It's when we try to shortcut, it's when we try to jump ahead that we end up with the same old problem.
So last question for you, Saul, and thank you so much for being patient with us. I'm so sorry to those of you whose questions we didn't get to. We will actually send them to Saul after the webinar, and perhaps if you include your email address and would like an answer, we can have him reply to you directly. So the last question we have for you is, people may be the same, but religions and cultures are not, especially treatment of women. How do you handle that? Can you change culture?
It's a great question. It's a very fine line. It's a tricky one. We're frankly not interested in cultural change for its sake, right? We're not interested in going in and sort of advising cultures on where they should adjust. If women are not given the right to borrow in a community, we certainly are not in a place to go in there and say, let your women borrow. That would be inappropriate. But what we can do is engage women and men in a dialogue around the social challenge, which in that case might be access to capital. Brainstorm a bunch of solutions. How might we increase access to financial capital with the local assets that we have? Come up with solutions and let the local population uncover the challenge themselves. Because when a local person decides, wow, we really need women to be able to pay loans or get loans, and it's in their interest and they come to that conclusion on their own, which they do and which they will do, then cultural change can happen. But if you go in with an agenda to change the culture, you will face unbelievable resistance. So the nuance here is engaging with people on the question and moving with them towards the solution. And if they embrace a cultural change, then you might be onto something very big.
That's a tremendous way to wrap our presentation, and obviously there's so many more questions because this topic is of great interest to our community, and there are many more questions that can be answered here and can be discussed. And we'd like to thank you, Saul, for letting us pick your brain, and thank all of you from around the world for tuning in today. For those of you who are qualified to receive professional development hours, the PDH code is listed on this current slide. Please do remember to sign in your request or send in your request via email. More questions or any other inquiries, you can also email us at webinars@engineeringforchange.org. If you have any ideas about who you'd like to see present as a part of this webinar series, do let us know. We're very open to suggestions. And again, I'd like to thank you all for joining us and being patient as we run a little bit over time. And we hope to have you join us again on August 30th for our next presentation, and we look forward to seeing you on E4C and doing good work on the ground. Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Cheers.